Your Bibles up to the Gospel of John and chapter 16. We will be paying attention to and reading 16 through 33 as part of our study tonight. That's the Gospel of John, chapter 16, verse 16. Right now, though, if you would bow with me in prayer, we'll begin class with a moment of spiritual reflection and conversation with God, and then we'll get into it in earnest. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your word. We thank you for the time that we share together in study. Help us to be good students. Help us to know and understand your will in such a way that we serve you with open hearts in this kingdom. Help us as disciples to mature. Help us as servants to seek the good in others and forgive us of our sins. And we offer this prayer in your Son's name. Amen. All right, so we will be reading from John 16 in a second. John 16 through 33. We'll read that whole chunk. I noted upon reflection last week that I meant to read a few passages and I didn't, so I have sticky notes. So that we get to all of them. Easily distracted by good conversation sometimes. But I do have a question for you. I want you to think for a moment tonight about the last time where you felt all of a sudden alone. Where everything was fine and then it wasn't. And I'm thinking back for me to the first time. So you guys get to think about the last time. I want to think about the first time I remember that feeling very intensely. I think I was in second grade. And I was at Allison Elementary School, and very often my mom would pick me up from school so that we could go run errands, because it would take like 2 hours for the bus to take me home, or 5 minutes for a car. And so I'm standing there, and kids are going off, and then gradually it's just me and the supervisor standing there. And they look at me and it's like, "Is your mom picking her up today?" I'm like, "She told me she was." And so we go in the principal's office and call mom, and mom's at home still, just completely lost track of time. So the principal's office was not an unfamiliar place to me, so I just took my regular seat and waited for her to arrive, and everything was better. But there was a moment inside my little crystalline, growing brain, like, oh, Mom forgot me. What's going to happen now? That feeling of abandonment and dread, even though short-lived and essentially irrational, because I was never actually alone and my family hadn't actually forgotten me. It was just normal occurrence of life. It's something that at different points as I've grown older kind of reappears, right? Do you guys have a similar kind of feeling or a memory like that? How does it connect with the last time you truly felt alone? Are all of those past experiences where you felt alone and then you realized you weren't, do they help you navigate the current one? Or other things like that? What you guys thinking?
No, it doesn't. Once you get that feeling, it's in you, and the fear grips you.
Our emotions can own us to such a high degree that we can almost become paralyzed. Because you feel things so intensely, even if your rational brain starts going, what you're feeling doesn't make sense to your reality, everything's going to be okay. But your brain sometimes gets overwhelmed by your heart. Let's read now from John 16, and if you have more comments or questions, we can bring them back in a second. Rich, do you want to read some for us tonight? We're going to read that whole chunk. So is your voice up for it? This is verse 16 through verse 33, if you will.
Part of the dinner conversation.
That's correct.
A little while, and you will see me no longer. And again, in a little while, you will see me. So some of his disciples said to one another, "What is this that he says to us? A little while, and you will not see me, and then again, in a little while, you will see me, because I am going to the Father." So they were saying, "What does he mean by a little while? We do not know what he's talking about." Jesus knew that they wanted to ask him. So he said to them, "This is what you're asking yourselves. What I meant by saying, 'In a little while you will not see me, and again you will see me. Truly, truly, I say to you, you will weep and lament, but the world will rejoice. You will be sorrowful, but your sorrow will turn into joy. When a woman is giving birth, she has sorrow because her hour has come. But when she has delivered the baby, she no longer remembers the anguish for joy that a human being has been born into the world. So also, you have sorrow now, but I will see you again, and your hearts will rejoice, and no one will take that joy from you. In the day that you ask nothing of me, in the day you will ask nothing of me, truly, truly, I say to you, whatever you ask of the Father in my name, he will give it to you. Until now you have asked nothing in my name. Ask, and you will receive, that your joy may be full. I have said these things to you in figures of speech. The hour is coming when I will no longer speak to you in figures of speech, but will tell you plainly about the Father. And in that day you will ask my name, and I do not say to you that I will ask the Father on your behalf. For the Father himself loves you, because you have loved me and have believed that I came from God. I came from the Father and have come into the world, and now I'm leaving the world and going to the Father. His disciple says, now you are speaking plainly and not using figurative speech. Now we know that you know all things and do not need anyone to question you. This is why we believe that you came from God. And Jesus answered them, do you now believe? Behold, the hour is coming, indeed, it has come, when you will be scattered, each to his own home, and will leave me alone. Yet I am not alone, for the Father is with me. And I have said these things to you, that in me you may have peace. In the world you will have tribulation. But take heart, I have overcome the world.
So as we were reading, did you guys notice any passages that sparked questions or thoughts that you wanted to look into later or even discuss tonight? Whenever I'm reading the Bible and I'm paying attention to the words or someone else is reading it to me, I have a mental highlighter that I start swiping on things. And if I'm down actually by hand, I might actually make a little note. And one of those I think is super important for us tonight, which is, think about this little phrase. Right now, he's saying, I speak to you in figures of speech, but the time is coming when I will speak to you plainly. Every time I read that at the first level, I'm like, I want that time to be right now. Because there's a lot of stuff that Jesus says that are still recorded for us in figures of speech that I look at and go, man, there's a lot going on there. I wish he would just tell me. His disciples, though, listening to the same dialogue, are able to go, oh, now you're talking to us plainly. And I'm thinking, I'm still struggling to get some of this. But they seem to really catch it. But I want to add a last little tidbit to it. He doesn't think they've got it yet. Jesus is not sure they're with him. And I say that because of the next few phrases he gives them. He says, hey, look, you guys think you got it? You don't know what's about to happen. You don't know that scattering is going to happen. You don't know that it's going to get rough. And everything he says in general terms comes to pass. They are all scattered, and yet they all come back. You know, this smaller group context. That still all takes place. What else? Something else maybe you caught there, or secondary comments on the same themes, or additional stuff from my opener of the class?
I think
Rich?
one of the phrases he says is that they'll figure it out, and no one can take that joy from them.
Yeah.
Right? So you're like, oh, okay, something cool is going to happen that they'll never forget.
Yeah. Bobby first, and then Les.
It seemed like Judas hadn't betrayed him yet.
Judas has either left the room at this point or is not the focal point of this dialogue. Well, one thing you have to always remember is the Gospels are, by God's hand, assembled documents. They're not a tape recording. And so the sequence isn't always going to be ABC. Sometimes it's C-A-Z in the way it's laid out. Les?
It's hard for us, at least it is for me, it's hard for me to put myself in their place because I already know the outcome. And it's hard to get that, when you already know the ending, how it all worked out, it's hard to get that out of your mind and try to picture how they really felt.
Yeah. And we're on the receiving end on this weird flipping of circumstances. He says, the world is going to rejoice regarding what's about to happen. They're going to think it's fantastic. And y'all are going to be just broken. He says, but it's going to turn around, that your sorrow is going to be turned to joy. That's a hard thing to swallow when we think about grief, right? Some things don't ever seem to heal well. Some hurts. And I want to think in the very minor level right now, very simple. Going back to school-age experiences, I can still remember things that my teachers said to me about my potential and lack thereof, to be specific. And it's been a while since elementary school, and you would have thought that by now I would have figured out that they were either just having a bad day or I was having a bad day. Both of those are possible. But does it stick? Yeah, it's a pretty minor thing. Most of the stuff was just things that probably didn't mean as much when they said it, but it meant a lot to me as a kid when I heard it. And yet, that sorrow is just kind of latched in. That's a minor level thing. Jesus is talking about something that's so much more substantial, and yet he says your sorrow will be turned to joy. How does that happen? How does our sorrow turn to joy? There's three things that happen in this passage that help us get there, but I'm curious as to what your answers would be if someone came to you and said, hey, what does Jesus mean when he says your sorrow will be turned to joy?
Again, I would have to recount to them what I know.
Yeah.
The crucifixion and him coming back. The sorrow is when he's crucified and they feel like it's all over with. I mean, it's done. They don't see the hope at the end. And it would be a helpless feeling.
Yeah. Part of it is understanding. If we know why something's going down, we're probably a little bit more likely to figure it out. Like, oh, this is happening because this over here is going to happen. And so to get from here to there, I got to go across that route. Nana?
Sometimes passage of time, we tend to understand things a little bit more than when it actually has happened. So the passage of time sometimes helps.
Yeah, it has to be kind of, get some perspective. A new point of view from maturity sometimes helps. Bobby?
I think Peter didn't understand it because after Christ was crucified, he wanted to go fishing.
Yeah. Well, and look, there's nothing wrong with that level of response to it. It's like, let's go back to fish. Let's go back to what we know. He went back to familiar times. Here's something that happens in the first part of the text. God is helping us understand that he is not just going to miraculously transform our feelings and make us feel different. What he's going to do is transform the way we think about things. And by the way, if you want to tie some Bible passages together, a great one right here is in Romans in chapter 12 and verses 1 and 2, where we're literally told regarding how our transformation is the renewing of our mind. And that's a great principle to kind of latch on to. It's like, hey, okay. So right now, the first principle is I'm going to get a new understanding. Perspective might help. Experience or familiarity might give me the time to gain that perspective. But God is going to reveal something, and he did to these very people. These disciples would eventually become the apostles, who would have everything Jesus said brought to their remembrance and the aid of the Spirit to contextualize it. And so these folks would learn that, hey, Jesus had to die. Because one of the things that Les keyed in on that's I think is super important, in potentially a different way than you and I, Jesus was their friend. And it's partly why in the Gospels and in the writings of the apostles and disciples after that, it's talked about how those who live afterwards have to actually have a greater level of faith than those who walk with him. But he's literally their friend who they've spent the last 3 years with or more. And potentially could have had longer interactions because of the areas in which they grew up. And he's going to die unjustly. In the case of some of them, in front of them. While one of them is going to be taking care of his mama. So the level of emotional, earthly context there is going to be substantial. And he's telling them about this, again, using some figures of speech. And I think it's important as I read through the text that he uses one to all these male apostles, disciples, that how can they really understand childbirth? Do they understand it like women folk do? I know. I can tell you the observational side. But he tells them the same thing. A key point for me to realize is that I don't have to understand it in the same way that a woman does. I just have to recognize that there is a change because there's a gift or a blessing on the outcome after the pain. He's not being obtuse or obscure. And those who have been raised in this agrarian culture would have seen lots of childbirths and potentially could have been assistants in any number of animal births as well as other births in the family. Who knows? It would have a different culture, different context in that regard. But he says that in such a way that you should know this. You should already know. And that's how childbirth is. And you don't have to experience it to know that's what's going on. Michael? Oh, you were going to... You're shaking your head in yes, and so I was figuring... Yeah, he's agreeing on our ignorance of childbirth. We have no knowledge thereof. The next thing that happens in the text that goes from this principle is he starts connecting a promise to them regarding joy. That you will be joyful again. Things that don't work in my box of don't do these things is any kind of an effort on my part to tell somebody how to feel. I've never felt that actually is a functional thing. Oh, stop being sad. Does that actually work? I have enough trouble helping myself sometimes out of slumps of sorrow. So you can't tell somebody that they're going to be joyful, but you kind of can. You ever give someone a gift and you know that they're just going to be thrilled to get it? Like you figured it, you cracked the code. Like you know that you have figured out that this is the thing that they've been wanting and they never would have gotten for themselves. And when you deliver it to them, they're just going to lose their minds. At that point, we do. We actually can tell them how to feel in a different way because we're leading them to a spot. Here's the thing. And keep in mind, that thing doesn't have to be super expensive. Doesn't have to be rare. It just has to be something they really want, right? It could be something obscure and unique to their childhood or something special. Jesus is saying that at the end of this experience, there's going to be something there that you are going to rejoice in a way that you can't understand right now. Plus, they probably don't even understand their sorrow yet either. At least to no substantial degree. So, he's making them a promise, and I'll say it's a promise on the same level of any of the other promises he gives to the disciples. Remember, he is God. He is a prophet. He is the anointed. So his level of commitment to this end is otherworldly, if you will. Throughout all of his work, he had continued to try to draw them to understand that this is actually how it works with God. That when you ask God and he promises it, it comes to pass. And so he's trying to frame that same concept into this promise to them. That if they ask, they'll be made full of joy. And then think of just a few pages forward in our Bibles, thematically and physically. When they're preaching on Pentecost, do they sound like sad people? Now, the sermon that Peter preaches is triumphant. It's grave level in its substance. It's very serious, but it's triumphant. And then, and this is the last kind of edging of it, it's a shift in their position. Not only are you going to have the flipping of joy and sorrow, but remember that this community of disciples that are surrounding Jesus are effectively the outcasts. They are the others. So however you want to describe the people that you think about as being the ones who are always left out, that's who these Israelites were culturally. I remember my parents talking a little bit about, particularly my mom, how when she moved to Ridgecrest, California, her family came by way of Oklahoma. And her and one other family, they were the Okies. And that meant that they were hillbillies to these Californians. Now, you got to understand, if you'd ever been to Riverside, which is where Ridgecrest is my dad's town, Riverside, where they grew up, Riverside ain't much of a town. It's back in the time when I was driving through it, it had one great thing. It had a McDonald's inside of a train. And that was about it. And traffic. And so it wasn't like they were like, oh, we're Beverly Hills. They were the foothills of the valley. And so she saw herself as being an outcast. And she probably was at that time. Israel had these Galileans, these folks from Bethlehem, as being the ones nobody cared about. And Jesus is telling them, you're going to shift a little bit. Your position in the world is going to be different. Did they really understand that either? How do we feel, and this is the last part of thinking this text before we get to maybe a little bit more detail. As Christians, do you feel like an outcast sometime?
Yeah.
What are some of the moments when that feeling is the strongest, when you feel like you are absolutely being left out because of what you believe? Not for anything you've done. Sometimes you get left out because you're just not fun, or you're just mean, or you just weren't invited, or you weren't part of the crowd to begin with. But legitimately because you believe in Jesus. Bobby?
You feel left out when you're trying to teach somebody and they just don't seem to understand that it's best for them to change what they're doing.
Yeah, sometimes it's exclusion because we want to include them into the kingdom, and for whatever reason, they're not interested. Or, it happens a lot in social organizations, probably for some of you at work, when they have a party, and they know they're going to serve alcohol there, and rather than not serve alcohol, they just don't invite you. You ever have that experience? That might be a little bit better than them actually having the party, inviting you, and showing up and everyone's drunk. I haven't figured out which one feels better yet. But that happens a lot throughout our society. One of the things that I think is important to catch, and just a side note for it, very often you're not the only one who's excluded in those experiences. You're never alone. There's always somebody else who's probably excluded for the very same circumstance that you didn't know about, that also wasn't invited to the Inn Club. And eventually you might realize, you know what, it might be better off. Maybe I don't want to be in that club to begin with. But the neat thing that Jesus is trying to help them understand, and the most powerful one, is they're actually never alone. Jesus says he's not going to be alone either. He says his Father is going to be with him. And he and his Father will be with them. And that's the powerful part of his message, that they think they've understood because it's not in a figure of speech anymore, as it's translated for us. Oh, I get it now. They didn't act like they got it, did they? Because if they really understood it, they would have gone to the cross with a little bit different perspective, right? They would have been able to see the joy that was coming afterwards. And for whatever reason, it didn't seem like any of them truly saw through the sorrow to the joy. Les, did you have something?
I was just thinking about, he had already told them earlier in this same chapter that it's better for him to go away because he's going to send them a comforter. If he don't go away, then the comforter won't come.
Yeah.
But that too is hard for them to understand, because they don't really know exactly what he means by the comforter is going to help them. It's going to take a little while for them to get the experience from it, and then they will see it.
Damn.
But he's telling them a lot of things, and it had to be extremely difficult for them to try to figure out all this stuff about, what's a comforter, what can a comforter do?
Yeah, what good is a comforter when you seem to be telling me that you, who we think is God, you're going to leave us? No comforter can replace that. Now, they didn't understand that the comforter also is God, nor what the comforter would accomplish for them so that they would have the memory of him with them all times. Like there's a lot going on there. Okay, so connected to this is another principle. It comes from 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 12, as well as 1 Timothy 1 and verse 18. It's the idea of fighting the good fight of faith. And there's a lot of different ways and edges to that terminology. One of my behaviors, and maybe it's yours, is when I realize that I feel that abandonment feeling, I immediately start telling myself, you can take this. You can take anything for 24 hours. You can handle this. In fact, this is going to make you better. Even more so, you'll be tougher, you'll be stronger, and you can fight back on all those feelings, and you can just bottle them up and throw them away, and everything's going to be just fine. Now, I don't know if you guys do that or something similar. I think we all kind of do stuff like that to different degrees. But there's a lot of wrong in that feeling, that you can just do it yourself. Because if you go back to 1 Timothy and you go back to what Jesus is saying, he never says that you're going to be successful by yourself. He actually indicates that you're going to be successful by leaning on the people who are around you and being built up by them and building them up. As well as, when we think about fighting our good fight of faith, like Paul is talking about, here's a great illustration of it. His highest successes only occur when he's not alone. And when he's alone, he ain't doing much. And that's the narrative of Paul's life. When someone shows up, all of a sudden, he's able to go to work for lots of reasons. There's thematic reasons, there's personal reasons, etc. Because in that same Timothy letter set, 1 Timothy and 2 Timothy, Paul writes to Timothy again, 2 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 12, this: "Indeed, all who desire to live godly in Christ Jesus will be persecuted." So to the first disciples, Jesus says, you're going to go through this transformative experience, and you're going to have all this sorrow, but it's going to be turned into joy. Paul, who went through experiences like that as well, writes to Timothy and says, look, if you desire to live a godly life, you will eventually encounter conflict because of your God-focused principles. And he tells them that it's going to be okay because he won't be alone either. It's the same message that Jesus is saying to the disciples, Paul says to Timothy. You're not going to be alone. Paul also says he's never been alone. He talks specifically in his letters about the two sources of comfort. One is God. The other is that his brethren's never abandoned him. Some left. But you'll note there was always somebody who went to check on him, came to comfort him, came to support him, brought him the supplies that he needed. Some even would be willing to travel across the whole world to bring him some books and a cloak. You start thinking about that. How far is it to get to where Paul is? Well, it's either by ship or land in ship. And what Paul wants is a cloak to be hand-delivered to him. I don't know about you, but if I needed a cloak, any old cloak will do if you're cold. But there's something special in that connection that he knows that person will go ahead and step up to thee. And Titus seemed to have developed that level of trust and were willing to come and support him, and others had done the same thing. Note this, and this is kind of starting to tie these principles together. This is from 2 Corinthians chapter 10. Michael, do you want to read for us? 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 3, 4, and 5.
For though we walk in the flesh, we do not war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but divinely powerful for the destruction of the fortress. We are destroying speculations and every lofty thing raised up against the knowledge of God. We are taking every thought captive to the obedience of Christ.
Think about this. Jesus closes John 16, verse 33 with this statement. But take heart, I have overcome the world. He says that before the cross. He says that before their sorrow. He's saying that in a tense and grammar and a statement to give them hope. To help encourage them to, hey, look, it's going to be okay. Because he's already fought the devil and won, if you will, right? In the temptations. That narrative that describes the conflict between the heavenly realm and the earthly realm, and what the only thing that the devil could offer to Jesus is earthly things. He can't give him any kind of true power. And Jesus rejects them all to keep his status as God, as kind of the holistic story that's being told there. And so the outcome of here Jesus saying, I've overcome the world. For these people who don't even understand the level of conflict that's about to go down, and then they'll think about it again later. He's overcome the world. That's the parallel to our passage here in Ephesians and the statements that Paul makes to Timothy about how we overcome the world. We can't do it individually. We can become overcomers by latching into the community that Christ is inviting us into. But that community exists because he has already overcome the world. If you want to have the bad sports analogies, it's like being willing to get on the bandwagon of the winning team. That's a bad sports analogy, but it kind of fits right here. Because he's already said, look, the ring's mine. And I love how Paul writes about it. That's a great kind of earthly perspective. He writes and says, while living, there is what laid up for him? What does he say? He says a crown. There's a crown. He actually has a dialogue that I don't know if I have the level of interpersonal strength at times to really say. He's like, I can't tell. Is it better for me to die and go to heaven, or to stay and encourage and support my brethren? By the way, if you want to really bother yourself for a few nights in a row, have that be the thing you think about. And whatever answers you come up with, I'm guaranteeing you they're better than mine. Because I don't know at what point in life that's the answer that you can come up with and feel comfortable with it. And yet by inspiration, Paul writes that one down for all eternity. There's a crown laid up for me. I can't tell if that crown's better than here. Because a lot of times, and most of the time, crown always feels better than here. But I do understand the draw on other sides of the level. So here's something to think about as we kind of narrow back our focus. Our goal is to properly understand a worldview of an overcomer. And I think there's something important that the disciples had that we need. They have the ability to allow their sorrow to be turned to joy. Something I think should be universally true about Christians is that we should be joyful people. We should absolutely, in every context, have the willingness to allow our sorrow to be turned to joy. That's a little bit different than a lot of the world around us. And let me kind of narrow it down. This is genuine joy. You can see people faking it all the time. People who are faking being happy. But we need to be people who are willing to have that experience and behave that way. How much of our lives gets wasted while being bitter? Whatever percentage you want to put out there, that's too much, right? Here's a kind of a thing to think about. It's a project, if you will. Every time you feel bitter, start a clock. Throw a little stopwatch on it. And just keep staring at it and think to yourself, I ain't ever getting that time back. And it may not change how you feel, but it's certainly going to quantify what you're doing with your feelings. The Bible tells us, as a kind of a level space, that disciples should be willing to not only weep with one another, but also rejoice with one another. So as a parallel to that project, think about a way that you can rejoice with somebody else. How many of you follow Terry Ford on Facebook? Still on the social medias with him. You know what I love that Terry continues to do with regularity with his particular account? If he sees a baptism appear on social media, I think he's got like an automatic macro that says, like, comment, share. He sends it out. It's a great opportunity to rejoice when you know others are rejoicing. And that's a great starting point. Our life is full of enough bad, and we're fed enough awful, that we who should be the most joyful probably need to be doing a better job of being joy-filled. All right, so we have our classic conversational tidbits at the close of this. When you think about John 16, our primary text, what is it that you like there? Michael?
I like what Les said earlier, that I have the ending and it's a crystal clear picture for me. Because if I put myself in their shoes, I don't think I would have understood any of that. Yeah. So I like that we can look back at this story.
Yeah, I love our positioning, if you will. I got to tell you, when they say, oh, now you're speaking plainly, I don't feel that at all when I'm reading them either. I feel like, and like I think Jesus is answering them, they don't get it yet. There's a lot that they haven't really figured out. But he did shift from using metaphors to being plain. He said, I'm leaving, and then I'll come back. And they thought it was metaphor, and he was actually pretty specific. Les?
I guess I like the thought that he gives them hope.
Yeah.
I know it's hard at their time to see the hope for everything that they're so confused about. But it's something that can be hard for us to see too, going through the difficulties and things in this world. But the hope is there. Things can be better if we'll allow it to be.
Yeah. You think about how many people that you've interacted with, and maybe also I'm going to include those who have been within the body of Christ, those who have been part of churches I have been part of, who have a method of interaction that's only critical, that's only fault-finding. What kind of harm does that do to everybody if you're always picked on? It'll destroy you quick. It'll destroy churches. It'll destroy hearts. And what I love about Jesus, among many things, is that he always presents his message and his conversations as, it's going to be okay. Here's hope for you. Even those who are being condemned, there's still time. There's grand hope. And I think we need to get better at that too. Because if you're like me, you've been around a lot of that hyper-focused claw, and it leaves its scar. And if you've experienced a thing for a long time, you're more than likely going to repeat it without even thinking about it. Les?
I was thinking really kind of along that same line today, because some things that I saw on my phone, on Facebook, that got me to thinking. And every day that we get up, we have a choice. We can choose to be happy, or we can choose to be sad. And it's up to us to make that right choice. If we make up our mind, no matter how bad things are, I'm going to be happy today and good.
Yeah. There's a good thing to see every day somewhere if you're looking. Even if it's just a flower that decided to bloom today. And by the way, what's a flower to you is a weed to somebody else. And a weed to somebody else might be a flower to you. I think it's really important to realize that there's small little good things and wonderful things all the time that kind of engulf us. I got a lot of questions I want answered. I'm curious which ones you want answered. There's a lot of stuff that goes on even right in this text that I feel like is still a mystery. But did you notice something in there that you just don't have an answer to? I'll give you mine. All of his figures of speech that Jesus uses, could you give me a diagram for those? I'd like that, Jesus, if you would just lay it out for me with a map as to which some of them go to. And if you could give me a little crib sheet of notes to help understand Paul, that'd be great too. That's a secondary bonus. What does this teach us about the King whom we serve? What do we learn about Jesus right here?
He's on our side.
Yeah. He really cares about us. He cares about them in a personal way. When in the Sermon on the Mount, he talks about counting or numbering your head, that God can do that and has done that and knows you that well. It's easy to push that off and say, oh, it's just a metaphor. It's just a figure of speech. And yet here he is interacting with his disciples and individually begins to point out their triumphs before they happen, even if it's going to come after failure. That you will return to me, like he does with Peter. You're going to deny me 3 times, but when you come back, encourage the flock, strengthen the flock, tend the sheep. So there's some great interactions that take place there. That's it for tonight. We have one more class in the series and one more thing to work on next Wednesday evening, which is our relationship to the world. And that'll be next Wednesday night. Thanks, everybody.